Hello, this is John Maggiore with MaggioreOnBowie.com, and I am here with a very, very special guest today. Lance Olsen is the author of over 30 books, including 17 novels, short stories, essays, poems, reviews, all of which have appeared in hundreds of journals, magazines, and anthologies. He's known for blurring the lines between fiction and history, and I would say, and you might dispute me on this, but I would say philosophy too. Um, he's a professor emeritus at the University of Utah and has taught elsewhere. And his most recent book is called Absolute Away. But the book we're going to talk to, we're going to harken back to yesteryear. We're going to go all the way back to 2023 and talk about his novel, Always Crashing in the Same Car, which is styled as a novel after David Bowie. And we were talking before we started this interview, and I was saying that I'm somewhat reluctant to characterize the novel, which I read, and it's wonderful. It's a really great book, whether you're interested in David Bowie or not. But I have to tell you what we're talking about. And I would say in brief that the book is about the decline and ultimate death of David Bowie. Is that fair?
That is totally fair.
Okay. So, Lance, thank you very much for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Oh, and thanks so much for having me. It's really fun to get to talk with somebody who's as steeped in all things Bowie as you are.
So along those lines, the novel, it really, like I said, it sort of blurs the line between fiction and history. And I wanted to ask you before we get into the specifics of the novel, what makes a novel? I was reminded of the disclaimer in front of the Todd Haynes film Velvet Goldmine, which is loosely but very recognizably based on David Bowie, which there's this disclaimer similar to disclaimer that you have in the back of your book that says, although what you're about to see is a work of fiction, it should nevertheless be played at maximum volume, which Bowie fans will recognize. So what makes a novel?
Such a good entry question, and I think maybe the way I think about it is this, that if you're talking about a sonnet, let's say, you're talking about a villanelle, it comes with very strict rules. A novel is a different beast altogether. It really is this kind of omniphagic mode that eats up lots of other things while never knowing exactly what it is.
Yeah,
And so, if one looks back at the history of the novel, one is really looking back at a history of a genre trying to invent itself. And the stuff that we might read in graduate school, let's say, are actually those kind of miles posts that tell us, oh, something really big has changed. Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, James Joyce's Ulysses, whatever. And all of those are trying to figure out, like, well, what the heck is this form and what can it do? And so
yeah.
I think, for me, that's the excitement of entering this genre. It's the genre that doesn't know what it is as a genre.
That's excellent. So, again, before we get right into the book, the chapters are named after Bowie songs. And the title itself, Bowie fans will recognize, is named after a song off the album Low. And even after finishing the book, I was thinking about why did you choose this particular song title as the name of the entire book? So I'm going to ask you that. Why always crash in the same car?
And I think, two different things. It gets us into two different areas. One of them is that Bowie himself, as I'm sure we'll talk about, was always crashing into different selves.
Yeah,
And I love that as a key metaphor for the text. But also to go back to your first question, in many ways, that's what this novel does. It crashes into lots of genres, right? So
yeah,
we're talking about, sort of biography, autobiography. We're talking about lots of different voices. And so, the way I think of the novel is as a kind of subset of a collage. That is, collage is defined by something that has many voices on one canvas. Um, I'm thinking of the artist Joseph Cornell was asked once what his art was about, and he said he just handed the interviewer back a piece of paper, and on the piece of paper it said reality equals collage. And also, the other artist, Robert Motherwell, once said that collage was the greatest innovation of the 20th century. And I think there's a reason for that. Collage embraces multiplicity. Bowie was nothing if not the multiple. And it also embraces a sense of, what would you call it, sort of not settling among genres. So for me, it's really important to keep in mind, and this takes us back to something you said in the introduction about philosophy. I'm very, very interested in philosophy and always have been, that every form suggests a philosophy.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times when we're reading novels, let's say, we think of the novel existing at the level of character, which it absolutely does, at the level of scene, which it absolutely does, at the level of thematics, which it absolutely does. But it also exists as a form whose very form is suggesting a way of looking at the world. And collage takes us back, not to get all fancy on us, but to Nietzsche's idea of perspectivism. And Nietzsche talks about, and revolutionarily so in the late 19th century, this idea that we can't look at the world from one perspective. All we can do is to look at the world in multiples. You look at the world differently than I look at the world. People in your audience may look at it very differently than either of us. And that's wonderful. So what I tried to do in the novel is come up with a whole bunch of voices, music critics, lovers of Bowie, reviewers who gave him crummy reviews,
Yeah.
all sorts of voices, and said somewhere in those voices you're going to find your Bowie, but not in any sense of a stable Bowie. And that's what's so wonderful, right? I mean, we can take it back, changes, right? I mean, it's all about that with Bowie, and I think that's really kind of alluring to me. So one last point, and that is, as I get into novels, one of the things that draws me in when I'm writing a novel is a really good problem. And Bowie for me is a really good problem.
Yeah.
His music, I mean, my gosh, his music changed so much over time, but even at any given time, it was trying so many different kinds of things. And then Bowie himself, was the chameleon, for reasons, for really interesting reasons. And so then the question becomes, what would a book look like that embodied that sense of identity?
Yeah.
And what I came up with was some form of always crashing.
Yeah. That's interesting, but and I don't want to spend too much time just on the title, but everything you're describing jumps out to me after reading the book. The book is about perspective. It is about the relationship between perception and objective reality, to the extent that there is objective reality. And that puzzle aspect of David Bowie. I write a daily blog about David Bowie, and how can that possibly be because of that puzzle? I mean, it's constantly, not only is exploring him and his music and his lyrics, unlocking different puzzles, but it also takes me on, just myself on different side tracks, sometimes far afield from Bowie himself. But I also, the title, I didn't get any of that from the title until you just explained. There's a subtext. I don't want to do the talking, but there's a subtext in the book about its commentary on art, not just his art, musical art, but the art of writing and the art of the novel. But also, there's a very upfront story about dying, and that's very universal. And I sort of got from the title that this story is everybody's story, basically. I mean, we're all going to end ultimately the same way. The details might be a little different, but we're always crashing in the same car.
Oh, that's absolutely right as well. I mean, this is a novel and so I think of novels not as, what would you call them, sort of fun, actiony sorts of adventures. I really think of them as spaces of contemplation.
Yeah.
And when you enter a novel, either to write it or to read it, you have a very special and intimate relationship with the material.
Yeah.
And And I think one of the things that Bowie understood, I'm thinking now of where are we now in 2013, and that voice that comes across in that one song. That is so aware, he's the opposite of young.
Yeah,
And the time itself has become, the apex predator, right? I mean, that's the thing that's going to get us all eventually. Like you say, the details may be different. The outcome is always the same. Okay, quick digression, which is that in weird ways, that's what every novel teaches us at the deep structure, every form suggestive philosophy. Every novel ends. Every novel, you turn a page and it's a blank page. That's important, I think. And then in Bowie's life, Bowie, there were so many Bowies, right? But toward the end, he became, frail. He became, in many ways, the antithesis of who he had been at the beginning, with Space Oddity and so on. And that really captured me because there was this moment, and we all remember this if we've lived long enough, of rock and roll suddenly, you know, turning 50, right?
yeah,
And everybody was like, this idea of like, don't trust anybody over 30 kind of looks quaint at a certain point in one's life. And like, how do you do that? How, for Bowie, how do you make music? How do you make your art interesting for you? So yeah, at a whole different level, I think that is absolutely a good way into the text.
not to get way afield, but this actually is relevant to what's in the book. Um, we sometimes encounter this thought or this attitude about Bowie that he had this great run from 1969 until the early 80s, and then what happened to David Bowie, right? And there's
Mhm.
almost you have references to reviews of some of his later albums that is more or less asked that question. They're very harsh reviews, and one something that occurred to me. I'm 55 years old, and as I entered my 50s, the relevance of the album Hours suddenly became clear to me that Bowie stopped writing music for teenagers and he
Yeah.
started writing music for middle-aged men. And you mentioned Where Are We Now, where that voice, the voice of an old man, right? In his last two albums, The Next Day and Black Star, are he's not writing for middle-aged men, he's writing for old men.
Yeah, and how do you do that? Like he was right up to the end, he was inventing himself, as he went along. And I mean, it's the early Bowie that drew me into Bowie, right?
Yeah,
So I think, Ziggy Stardust, 1972, Diamond Dogs, 74. And then for me, the pivotal albums, and I think we can hear this in the later albums, are the Berlin trilogy.
yeah,
And Heroes blew me away. The work that Tony Visconti did in the production, the work, that they were doing with Brian Eno. And remember, when albums had A sides and B sides, the B sides always being like the crazy stuff.
yes,
And I was like, oh my God, as this um, kid who grew up in this, what would you call it, sort of leaf-lined, mall-lined, Paramus, New Jersey kind of life. Um, Listening to that opened my ears to a whole kind of sonic range that hadn't happened. But like you said, I guiltily sort of fell away from Bowie. I think partially with the whole kind of Let's Dance stuff because he was getting so popular it wasn't cool anymore.
yeah,
Part of it was the Tin Machine just didn't, those years didn't speak to me as much. And then all of a sudden this kind of blossoming in 2013 again with a kind of like incredible power. Like I remember like a kid playing Where Are We Now over and over again, and that incredibly great video of Where Are We Now too.
right,
That
yeah,
sort of harken back to his years in Berlin and all of that. And then how he kept us guessing right up to the end of his life. because he was so, what would you call, so passionately inventive and creative that you had no idea he was dying, which, becomes this kind of, what would you call it, emblem for all of us who are moving into our later years. It was like, you can live those years in lots of different ways, but Bowie taught us one way, which was kind of magnificent.
I'm getting ahead of myself. You have a quote um, uh, about him talking about not wasting any minute, and he was not wasting minutes up through the moment of his death, and he turned his death into art.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely right. And I'm thinking of Black Star for all different reasons. Um, but yeah, and the videos, right? The
Yeah,
Lazarus and so on. I mean, looking back on it, it was like, what were we thinking? And I don't know if you know this very strange thing. I'm not even sure it was intentional on his part, but the meaning of Black Star in mammographies, um, there's a proliferative breast lesion that when it appears to the radiologist, it looks like a black star, and so they
yeah,
label it as a black star. And was this a clue, even though he was dying of liver cancer, that this was coming? But everything was a clue at the end that his life wasn't going to be long, and yet to be able to paint, to be able to create music, to be able to you know keep and the just months beforehand, right? The play Lazarus,
right.
being out and him showing up to opening night and so on. Like that's extraordinary. That's fantastic.
Yeah, I and I'm going to come back to the book, but I remember when Lazarus was off Broadway. I live in New York State, and I was going to get around to going and seeing it.
Yeah.
Right, I was going to get around to going and seeing it. And when Black Star, the album, came out, I was, of course, listening to it repeatedly over and over and over, and trying to figure out what is this about? What is he? He's getting at something. And then the morning, which was a Monday morning, I think he actually died on a Sunday. But I got up and went down, and I turned on my iPad, and there's this news alert that he had died, and I was just stunned.
Yep.
Uh, but all of a sudden, the meaning of the album became very clear.
But it was oh exactly the same. I was lucky enough to be in Berlin at that moment, and it just sort of hit you like a ton of bricks too, because he was such an iconic figure, right? And so when that happens, it's like a part. I remember this with John Lennon too, at a much earlier age, that you felt history just take place and something slip into the past. And so I immediately went over to where Bowie had been living, close to Iggy Pop, sometimes with Iggy Pop, in Berlin. And within hours, people were flooding the area, and flowers and all different ages, all of this. And it was like, oh yeah, this was like incredibly important. And in many ways, I think maybe, I don't know if this is really true or not, but for younger people, he was kind of a secret handshake. Like, people meet him at some time in his life, and suddenly it's like, oh, my vision of music changed just a little bit.
Yeah,
And then us oldies are like, oh, a moment of who I am like went away. So that was amazing. That was
yeah.
amazing. Well,
I went to New York City, and the street that he lived on, Lafayette Street,
mhm.
had become the entire street had become a shrine, and there was a business at the end of the street that was playing his music on loudspeakers 24 hours a day for days, and it was the whole of New York City had a reaction. It was really amazing, because he was a New Yorker. I mean, he was a citizen of the world, but he was a New Yorker. He lived there
Yeah.
years. So let me get back to your book. The uh, the the book is still talking about the structure of the book and the structure of the novel. I wrote a note about the opening pages when I'm reading it.
Yeah.
I found disoriented. I was disoriented. I wasn't sure what I was reading, and shortly into the book, you have a character. I'm going to read the quote. Uh, you read a book with the belief that you're never going to leave it behind. Yet 20 pages in, you can't summon a single detail from page 3. And that inspired me to go back and read everything that came before, and suddenly it all made sense. And I was wondering, I mean, the book has an element of self-awareness. The book itself has an element of self-awareness, and that in particular, is that kind of a subtle instruction to the reader?
It is. I think two things to say about that. The first is my impression is, and I don't again know if this is really true, but certainly the books that I love do this, have embedded somewhere in them kind of a diagram or an engine of how to read it.
Yeah,
And a lot of time we were talking before we got on about Eco, Umberto Eco, and just that idea of books about books tend
yes,
to embed reading strategies in it. The
yeah,
second point I think is that at maybe the largest level, you're talking about the notions of death, seeping through the book. I was talking about form and notions of perspectivism and so on. But I think a whole different stratum is the notion of this book being about reading. And every reading, especially when you're doing novels, right? Every reading is going to, by nature, be a misreading.
yeah,
One gets to the heart of a novel, one gets to the heart of your novel, right? But we're always, reading different novels with the same title. But really, we're all different people, we're all different ages, we're all different educational statuses, we're all different socioeconomic. So we're always reading different books. It's so funny when you're teaching and you bring students together around a book, the very first thing you learn is that none of us read the same book.
yeah.
We know it's what we remember, what we don't remember, and so on. So at a really deep level for me, it was asking questions about reading as a philosophical dilemma. How and this kind of steps away from what we're talking about, but maybe not. Reading is such a magical act. Like you open a page and there are all these little squiggles on the page. And yet, through those squiggles, you fall into a world, you fall into a philosophy, you fall into an act of imagination. Um, Schopenhauer talked about reading as sharing the mind of somebody else.
Yeah.
And that's what you do. And like I said earlier, it's such an intimate sort of space. And so I wanted to get into that, but then think about, there's no time in our lives that we're not reading. That is to say, there's no time in our life when we don't think of the world as a kind of text and other people as kinds of texts. And how do we read other people? Like seriously, when we meet somebody, how do we make sense of those people? And then, even the more difficult question is how we make sense of ourselves by constructing narratives, by tinkering about the narratives, by understanding that we don't understand certain things about ourselves. All of those things are involved in reading as misreadings that don't get to a key sort of truth value under all of them. And of course, just to go back, and I know we talked about this a little bit in our exchanges before we met, is Bowie's songs are, of course, lessons in reading as misreading. It's like, how do you even make sense of some of the lyrics, especially the ones that are, shot through with these Burroughs-esque, Brian Geisen-like cut-ups. And so they become very associative, they become very personal, subjective readings, and so on. So he, in a very big way, is about reading. And then, of course, how do we read Bowie himself, which is the core problem of the book.
Right. And we're going to get into that. But you said
Okay.
two things that once again, it's sort of taking me off course. The one is you mentioned Tin Machine. I saw an interview that he gave once, and he's very unreliable. You can't trust what he says about
Yeah.
his own music. But he was questioned about Tin Machine, and he said, I challenge you to listen to this one song, I Can't Read.
Mhm.
And and the first it's on the first Tin Machine album, which my I there's I find a lot of redeeming value in that album. But one
Mhm.
of the things I don't like about it are there are several preachy songs. They're very overt. They're very sort of un-Bowie like, and I for years sort of just grouped I Can't Read into that. But it's really not about illiteracy. If I spent some time with the lyrics and listening to it, and he's really lamenting. I can't read anymore, and I think he can't interpret what's happening around him, or he can't read.
Mhm.
You know, he had always been ahead of the scene. He had always been on the cutting edge, and now he was at that point in 1989. He had was no longer cool, right? And he can't read the scene and reading. You're talking about reading, literally reading, but you're also talking about interpreting the squiggly lines of life, right?
Yeah.
And I really got that out of the book too.
I think, and one of the things that's so exciting, as you know so well, is that Bowie was an avid reader
Yeah,
at a different level. But one of the things that immediately attracted me to him as an imagination was the moment I discovered, that he had it when he was doing The Man Who Fell to Earth, had that trunk filled with books, and they weren't like cheesy books. It was like everything from Dante, Flaubert, Faulkner. But then there's Kerouac over here, Vladimir Nabokov over there, Martin Amis over there. I'm looking. Here we go. One of the books that most influenced me actually
yes,
is Bowie's bookshelf, right? And this kind of grows out of something that Borges tried to do, which was to list his most 100 influential books. But
I read that, by the way.
oh yeah.
Yeah,
Oh, I love that, and then to get into Bowie's mind and like look at what he cared about
yeah,
when in his reading. So if you're an avid reader of books, you're going to be an avid reader of those squiggles of the world, and you're going to very soon realize that we're all none of us can read in certain ways, right? Or we multiple read where we're bombarded with interpretations, no one of which is right.
yeah. So there's another line in the book that I think you attribute to the Bowie character. I don't know if this is based on something he actually said. People pick up books looking for what they think books will eternally supply because. And um, the Bowie himself really veered away from um, offering a definitive interpretation of his own work, or he seemed not to like the question, "What is this song about?"
Absolutely, and I think he really did. I mean, and I think we all do this. We when we're younger, we read for the because, right? So this
Yeah,
happened because this happened, and that happened because the other thing happened, and it creates a kind of what do you call it, sort of false narrative logic. But the truth is, at the core, there's not a because. There is.
yeah,
And I think that's something that Bowie, discovered over and over again in his life. That wasn't, this is one of the fun things about writing novels. This wasn't a Bowie quote. This was me kind of thinking through Bowie, but thinking, oh, this is something that Bowie would harmonize with, the way he saw that. So yeah, and I think there comes a point when that because goes away, in some existential way.
yeah. So I don't know if this is related to that, but within the book itself, although other people refer to Bowie as Bowie, the 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 perspective of the book never does. He's referred to as the man or a man, the man. Why? Why is that?
Well, I mean, a couple of reasons. It's great that you picked that up. The easiest reason is Aman said in an interview that when Bowie walked through the door, I love this as a metaphor. When Bowie walked through the door, um, they left the sort of cardboard cutouts of themselves outside, and Bowie became Davy.
Yeah,
Bowie, and that idea of so, and you'd mentioned this too, the way he does interviews, he was always performing.
Yeah.
There was always a sense when you looked at Bowie, it was like, was he acting a part? Was he dodging something? Was he being, that mischievous little sparkle he got in his eye when he had an interviewer and could play with them? All of those things going on. And so I think at one level, that notion of switching noun to pronoun um, is really revealing to me about how Bowie functioned in the world. He thought of himself other than the performances, I assume. And then that raises a larger question, which again, without getting into too much background, so Wittgenstein. Early 20th century philosopher, always had this great comeback when he got into an argument with somebody. He would, instead of arguing this very large philosophical level, he would always drop down to the grammar and he would say, your problem is that you don't understand that this is a grammatical mistake, not a philosophical mistake. And one of the for instance of that is he said, when you say I believe X, the antecedent to I is a grammatical mistake. It suggests that the I is stable over time. It suggests it refers to one thing, and it suggests that I can point to it. None of those things is true. So your argument's fallen apart before you get to your verb. And I think I wanted to play around with that notion with Bowie because the antecedent. It's like, what is the antecedent to Bowie? What is the antecedent to Davy Jones? What's the antecedent to the man?
Yeah.
And I think maybe they're all different, and maybe they're all, sort of oceanically large.
So this, I was planning to ask this later, but I think I'm going to ask it right now. So, unquestionably, Ziggy Stardust was a character that Bowie played.
Yeah.
So, was David Bowie a character? And if David Bowie was a character, can somebody else play David Bowie?
And
Like
I
James,
think
it's like,
and I think David Bowie was always playing David Bowie, playing David Bowie.
yeah,
And I think that's like so wonderful. And you know this, but you know how he grew up in many ways as much a kind of through mime and so on as a kind of three-dimensional performer, not just the musician. And I think I go back over those, videos of interviews that he did through the years, and it's so funny, his accent will change a little bit, his sort of personality, his tenor can move anywhere from snarky to really, really smart. Like when he's on Charlie Rose, he becomes a different guy than
yeah,
when, some interviewer before a show, that kind of thing. And I realized how much Bowie wasn't being Bowie. Bowie was being a Bowie that was contingent upon the room he was in, the people he was interacting with, and he became that performance. That and I think for me, one of the things that intrigues me about that is, in a sense, I guess we all do that, right? In a sense, cellularly, we're not the same person we were 15 years ago. But also, if we walk into a boardroom, we're going to act one way. If we walk into a club, we're going to act another way. And so we're all performing ourselves to some extent. And I wanted to sort of explore Bowie not only as this icon, but also as, in certain ways, an emblem for everyone.
yeah. So, speaking of interviews, you have a sequence in the book where the Bowie character is interviewed by someone who gets under his skin,
Yeah.
and he ends up walking out. And was he exposed there? Was he unable to act his way out of the situation? What was he upset about?
It's a great question. So the other side of that is you don't hear his answers. You only hear the questions in that sequence.
Right.
And one of the things that's going on is I literally collected some of the dumbest questions ever from interviews he gave. and sprinkled those throughout. It's the what's your favorite color kind of questions that one sometimes, you know, to one's horror gets in an interview situation. The other thing was at the same time that was happening, there are clearly these disarming questions about, for instance, excuse me, how it feels to be getting older.
Yeah.
How does it feel not to have had that many hits?
Yeah.
How does it feel not to be as big as you might have been back in the 70s? And so I think all of those things were getting under his skin. And then I think there were, a couple of those zingers that maybe got pretty close to the mark that he became, which he could. You could see this happen in some of his real life interviews where he got like ticked off that he would be asked something so personal
Yeah.
because that just wasn't who he was. And so I think all of those things go into creating that underwriting tension that moves through that. And then you can only imagine what his answers were because you only get the blank spaces.
Um, Before we go more into that, I don't want to get too far away from this question. There's a character in the book who is not or does not share the name with a real person, Alec Noon, who is actually a major character in the book. So who and what's the function that he plays?
Yeah, and so okay, so one of the things, so his name's Alec Nolans, and Alec
Oh,
Nolans is an anagram for Lance Olsen.
okay.
There are a couple of anagrams, no reason anybody would pick up on that. There are a couple playful anagrams of Lance Olsen. They tend to take the form of reviewers. And I think it's a kind of ironized version of the academic on the one hand. On the other hand, I wanted to explore how to say, okay, so a lot of people who read literary criticism think that the literary criticism is about the book that's being written about. My contention is that literary criticism is a form of spiritual autobiography, that you're writing as much about yourself as you're writing about the book that you're objectively writing about, right?
Yeah.
So part of what's going on for him is that he's suffered a major trauma in his life. His
Yeah.
his wife's died. He's gone over to Berlin. He's writing this book. He's well past tenure. He thinks this may be his last book. So he's writing the book actually he wanted to write all this time, which was, on Bowie. And in certain ways, he becomes a doppelganger for me writing the book. And in some ways, he becomes somebody who is only writing spiritual autobiography about a trauma and the nature of trauma. We like to narrativize trauma as something that happens to us and we, work through the trauma to health. But um, my own reading and my own sort of experience is that trauma just keeps coming back when you least expect it. Um, you can't shake it. It haunts you. It's a kind of ghost story that comes back. And so I wanted Alex to, in part, live in certain ways a parallel to Bowie. Bowie's dying. Alec Nolan's wife has died. He's very aware that he's coming to the end of his life. And so all of those things were bound up. And of course, back to Umberto Eco, he's stands in for the reader in many ways. He stands in for the person who's trying to make sense of the thing that can't be made sense of. And this is sort of getting us on a tangent again, but it's a fun tangent. So the etymology of the word narration goes back through the Latin to a word called that's narrare, and it just means to tell. Okay, but that root goes back to the Proto-Indo-European word that is spelled G-N-O. G-N-O comes into our language another way, which is the word to know. And so there's something really combined, right, deep in the heart of narrative. This is looking for the because of a mode of writing that tries to know the world, to understand the world. But what I have learned over and over again, and certainly with this project, is that actually writing and reading become a really productive form of unknowing, of unlearning, of shedding a lot of what we thought to be the truth. So when I went into this project, I'm looking over at some of the books that I was looking at as I prepared to dive into this. I thought what I would get is a better sense of Bowie. What I got was a kind of unfinalizable version of Bowie. This thing that, why you can write, continuously on the blog is because there's always more Bowie.
Yeah.
There's always more to discover that contradicts, that undermines, that harmonizes with, that rhymes with, and so on. And that again takes us back to a larger philosophical question about the notion of epistemology, and how much of epistemology and philosophy is built around the premise that we can know through philosophy. But if you read any five philosophers, you know that no two of them agree. So what they know is indeed an unknowing. And that is really, really interesting to me because I think it speaks to the heart. And then one more step back from that, which is, knowing ourselves. One of the things that a lot of people are talking about these days is literature providing a kind of space of empathy, which I think is totally true at one level. That we read, literature, we read novels to better understand those who aren't us. I think we also read to try to understand, who we are and what our place is. The problem is that it's very hard to have empathy for somebody who is completely other than you are, right? Who comes from, let's say, a different economic background, or a different, racial background, or a different educational background, whatever. It's extremely hard to actually understand another person. And to take that in the direction of always crashing, I think it's equally hard to understand ourselves, to have full empathy with ourselves, because we're sometimes so baffled by what we've done,
Yeah.
how we live, that we say one thing and do another, and so on. And to me, that's a really powerful zone to explore, in that fiction can do.
I'm reminded of another line in the book. Is there a larger reason to reading Bowie? What's the larger reason? Uh, what the larger reason is to reading ourselves, reading them.
Right, which goes back to
Yeah.
what we were talking about a little earlier, and the problem of reading, right?
Yeah.
And one hopes, certainly I do this, I'm sure you do this, I'm sure a lot of your audience does this. When you read, you don't only fall into a book, but part of you steps back and watches yourself falling into the book,
Yeah.
and watches your mind move through that book. And that is again another really intriguing thing that reading does. It's as much about sharing empathy with somebody who is utterly unlike us as it is about the problematics of reading itself, ourselves,
Yeah.
others, whatever. There's a philosopher, theorist whose name is Mikhail Bakhtin, and he has this idea called finalizability, unfinalizability in his term. And it's when we meet somebody, and that somebody could be a text, or that somebody could be a biological person. We try to finalize that person. We try to get a grip on that person. What is that person about? And you know how so many of us go through this idea of sort of categorizing. And what Bakhtin says is that we can't actually do that. Like if we pay attention, we realize that people change all the time, that it's extremely hard to finalize anybody. Same way with books, right? When we read a book, what we want to do is like get to the heart of that book and settle it and put it back on our shelves and walk away. But the truth is, with novels, they're designed to be unfinalizable. They're designed to sit around with 25 people and have 25 different readings. And I think, Bowie's kind of the poster child of unfinalizability. And I
Yeah.
think that's probably what attracts both of us to that space of Bowie. It's like, so what? Who was that man?
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you one last question about reading, and then get a little explore this concept of what I'll call his relativism a little bit more in
Mhm.
depth. But there's I feel almost compelled to bring this up. There's a passing mention of the book Gravity's Rainbow in the book as an example of a book that requires some decoding. And you sort of alluded to this several minutes ago uh, as it relates to Always Crashing. But the reason I'm bringing up Gravity's Rainbow is I tried reading it earlier this year and I gave up. And well, so why am I bringing it up? So where do you find the path? Where do you find specifically for this book, but in general, we're trying to read ourselves. We're trying to read David Bowie. We're trying to read music. We're trying to read novels. What's the decoder? What's the path? What's the process of learning how to read?
I well, I don't know yet. I'm
Yeah,
still doing it, trying to get there, and I think that speaks to the heart of your question. I don't think we ever learn how to read. I think what we do is to learn how to try to read,
yeah,
and to allow ourselves the space. So a really good example of this is reading a book, a hard book, like we mentioned Joyce's Ulysses, when you're 20 and in college for the first time, and then coming back to it, when you're 60. And if you're teaching it, I taught it multiple times, coming back each time every couple of years, you're a different person reading a different novel. And it's a mechanism to teach you about how you'll never get to the novel that is the way to learn how to read, right? You'll never get the code breaker. And Gravity's Rainbow is such a great example of that, right? Gravity's Rainbow is like a crazy text. And it's like designed to destabilize everything at the level of sentence, at the level of, scene, at the level of like 400 new people being introduced every 3 pages.
yeah,
And so it's a book almost to be studied about, so that you can understand how things will never settle. Those are the books that really excite me. I really want to suggest that books that make us work, books that make us feel and think in unusual ways, um, are, intrinsically more valuable than books that make us feel sort of warm and fuzzy and forgetful. The problem is that those are really hard books.
right.
And so, you have to kind of keep going back and trying again. This is mind meld on Gravity's Rainbow. I remember so much because Gravity's Rainbow, when it first came out, in I think it was 72. It was labeled as the most unread coffee table book in America. Everybody bought a copy, everybody set it down, and everybody tried a couple pages and walked away. And I was one of those people. I was in high school, so I could not have been more unprepared to pick up a book like that. I had no idea how to begin. I had no idea where to go. I remember the first line of Screaming Comes Across the Sky, and it just like blew me away. That is like such a great, but I had no idea what it referenced. I had no idea what this damn screaming was. It took me a while to figure out it was a V2. And so part of those books for me is drawing me back in again and again and again. And it took until I was a graduate student who, had a lot of stuff behind me before I could begin to make sense of it. And that delighted me because I knew I'd never be able to make real sense of it, just approximate sense. That delights me.
Well, that very much relates to this concept of relativism, I think,
Yeah.
and uh, that is very characteristic of Bowie, and also what what Bowie would say about his own art. Uh, I have some quotes from the book that several of them come uh, from Bowie himself. I don't think you made these up. Uh, I usually don't agree with what I said very much.
Right.
I'm always amazed that people take what I say seriously. Um, Everybody reads Codswallop up into David's lyrics, and uh, all art is unstable. There is no authoritative voice. There is only multiple readings, and that and my note and when my side note in the and the margin of the book on that is he talking about history, personality, reality? Is that what this book is about? Um, so let me sort of just pause there and that's the question. What is he talking about? Is he talking about everything?
And I think, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this, but I think Bowie was all about, multiplicity meaning as a kind of approximation, and meaning as something that can change depending on, temporal and spatial coordinates of where we are and what we've just done. And I think that brings me into another area maybe to talk about, to kind of reframe the metaphor of reading and meaning. And that's history. That's a whole other thing that this novel is about. It's about, you know, this historical figure called David Bowie. And what I wanted to do, there's a theorist who's named Linda Hutcheon, and Linda Hutcheon talks about something called historiographic metafiction. And it's fiction that grants that the past is a problem, that pastness is a problem, that truth recovery is probably impossible. And the reason it's impossible is not because, as our Republican friends would say, you could just change it up and rewrite history, that sort of stuff, but rather because pastness only comes to us through documentation. And so essentially we're reading texts about the past which were written by specific people at specific times, or specific groups of people at specific times, who tended to be the power winners of a given time, and so forth. And so historiographic metafiction is a kind of fiction that grants us that the past always comes to us as a problem, that we can't capture a moment, that we can only capture the impossibility of capturing the moment. And I really, that's another way to think of this novel, is this is a novel of historiographic metafiction, in the sense that, I read, like, as we were saying, I read a loads of documents. I read the biographies, and like the biography is so weird because you read one and you think, okay, I got a handle on Bowie. And then you read another one, Dylan Jones is over here, Wendy Lee's over here, and then you get a different Bowie. And it's like, oh my God, this is like, this is going to go on forever. And then you read the interviews. There's a book called The Last Interview, which is just a series of Bowie interviews that he did over the years. And it's so funny because he literally, you remember there's a quote somewhere in one of his interviews, I think it is, that says, I could be a Buddhist on Tuesday and a Nietzschean on Thursday. But he really could, right? He had that sort of negative capability of absorbing an interesting idea and making it his for 24 hours, and then going, yeah, but that really interests me over there. And I think that was another, answer to the question of why he got snarky with that interviewer in that one chapter, is because, she's trying to pin him, and he's the most unpinnable personality I think I've ever faced.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. But so this idea of history being a problem is, I think, essential to the understanding of the book. But it also reflects back on two different genres, which are biographies and memoirs, both of which tend to be written with a sense of becauseness to them. All right. My life became what it is because this. Or remember, our form suggests a philosophy that my life, this is a typical memoir structure. My life started in an Edenic way. Then I became whatever, a drug addict, a thief, a mercenary, and I fell from grace. Um, I suffered for years, and then I found some kind of transformation and came out okay. Um, that doesn't actually feel like life to me. That feels like a form imposing a philosophy on a text. And so it's not about actually a historical past. It's about a grammatical mistake that tried to narrativize itself. And that is again so much striking to the heart of what Always Crashing is about to me.
Yeah. There's another line that I think is attributed to Bowie. It's almost like the artist is just there to accompany the audience and what the audience is doing.
Yeah, which was a real Bowie quote. Some of my quotes aren't real Bowie quotes, but
Yeah.
many of the ones I think you can kind of intuit which ones are a
Yeah.
lot of times. And I think that's right, right. But Bowie create like at its most, right? We all think back to our teen years meeting Bowie for the first time, and he did something else then. But I think at best, what Bowie did was to create problems for his audience.
Yeah.
Whether it's how to listen, how to read one of his paintings, how to read Bowie, how to read what he says. If you don't have a strong sense of irony, listening to a Bowie interview goes nowhere. But if you do, it's like, I don't even know if he's taking himself seriously at this point, which is fun, but maddening if you're trying to read something.
Yeah. I don't know when he ever took himself seriously.
Thing, right?
Yeah.
But I think I mean I remember those early interviews he did when he was totally
Yeah.
Ziggy Stardusting, and these sort of quasi pompous British interviewers would come and sort of nose in the air, try to make fun of him, and it was just clear he was just dancing around them
Right.
the whole time, and it was just like, yeah, I will give you exactly what makes you angry. um,
Well, I'm sure you've come across this. There's an interview from before he was famous, in the mid '60s, where he is the fake leader of a fake movement, the
of the
Society,
hair, yeah.
right, Society for the Protection of Long-Haired Men, and he's doing that without being Ziggy Stardust. But I think what he got from that. So now I want to hear from you, but I feel compelled to tell this
Yeah, absolutely.
observation I made. So what he got from that was a kind of identity politics where he's able to get the stuffy interviewer mad with he's surrounded by these other long-haired teenage boys, and he's establishing an us, and a them, and he's sort of building his fan base because he's drawing a connection to somebody in the audience, but it's all made up, and the tension is manufactured. And he continued this with Ziggy Stardust, right? So he adopts. He's sort of surveying what's the most controversial persona I could take on to make the grown-ups mad, and it's a bisexual space alien in an open marriage, and he plays that about as far as he could go. I'm going to relate this back to something that's in the book, actually, and he has the good sense to know that he couldn't keep it going forever, so he kills off Ziggy, and then he does Young Americans, which I think today at the time it was a huge hit, and today it's regarded as a great album. It is a great album. I think that he was trying to be controversial with the concept of race mixing, which is a line out of a song in on the off the Scary Monsters album. Um, but it wasn't as controversial as he might have thought. He was maybe 10 years too late on that. So then he shifts again, and he identifies a persona that was even more infuriating to his parents' generation than a bisexual space alien, which is a fascist,
Hmm. The
right?
Thin White Duke, yeah.
And white Duke. And um, my observation was getting back to something that you have in your book. I'm amazed that people take what I say seriously. He killed off that character once actual neo-fascists started taking him seriously and using him as an icon. And there's a terrible movie that he made, which is called Just a Gigolo, where I think he's trying to exercise that. There's a
Hmm.
scene where he's killed by Nazis and his corpse is used by them. He's dressed up in a Nazi uniform. And you see this image that I've never seen outside the movie itself of Bowie dressed as a Nazi in a coffin. And it's, it's a bad movie, but he's playing with this concept of his identity and how identity can be manipulated by others and what's real and what's not real. Um, so I want to wrap up this portion of the interview. I'm sorry I'm doing the talking here, but I wanted to wrap up this portion of the interview with another observation that's in the book and just ask you to comment on it because what a lot of his audience got from him, you mentioned the mystery, the problems to unsolve, which is why I'm a big part of the reason why I'm writing about him every day and why I don't want to speak for you, but I think you said it's part of the reason that you're interested enough to write a novel about it. But a lot of fans get kind of an affirmation from him, from his various personalities. And you have this line: Bowie's collection of personas offer a liberating trajectory, while also providing an alternative to the American cliche of rugged individualism and fixed, in quotes, authentic identity. And you've been sort of touching on these themes, but so many fans will lock on to some of the lyrics in Heroes or the one song where he says you're not alone, which is Rock and Roll Suicide. And
Hmm.
they what you just said right there, that I quoted from your book, has been inspirational to fans for 50 years.
Yeah. Yeah, and in a way that's just beautiful because people really did find their own Bowies in Bowie, right? It's an act of willed misreading, to focus on one line rather than all the lines. And yet at the same time, what Bowie did do that was so powerful was saying, back to that rugged individualism thing, that you can explode these stereotypes, and you can enter the space of Heraclitean identity, and that's like empowering.
Yeah,
But he also, it's that idea of not settling. I talk in the novel about the China Girl video,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And how at first, people were talking about it being racist, and people were talking about it being, very much a sort of, uh, what would you call it, video of the colonialist
yes,
imagination and stuff. But I like read it completely differently. I read it as a critique of those things. Bowie, to know about Bowie is to realize that the tropes in that are all about undermining the obvious, right?
right,
The Thin White Duke is so much, um, the Nazi, but it's also the cocaine addict.
yeah,
That nothing sits still. So some people might our sort of neo-fascists might focus on that, but really Bowie has already deconstructed it. It's already undone if you're paying attention.
yeah. Oh, the China Girl diversion in the book, that part of my observation about the reaction to the Thin White Duke is China Girl. He
Mhm.
wrote that Iggy Pop in 1976. He recorded it himself in 1983, but he wrote it in 76, weeks after this incident where he was photographed in a way that appears like he's giving the Nazi salute as
Yes.
the White Duke. And
Yeah.
he's got this part of that song China Girl where my response to anybody who thinks that it's racist. So the lines in the song: I stumbled into town just like a sacred cow, visions of swastikas in my head, plans for everyone. Is that supposed to be a good thing? Right?
No.
It's like he's celebrating that. No. And but I think that this was part of his trying to cope with, or trying to process that reading of the character that he created, which he himself, I don't know, thought was going to go in that direction.
That's a great reading, and this goes back to what we've been talking about. But to know Bowie is not to fully trust him, or maybe a better way to say it is to realize that anything that he creates is complex and conflicted. And the more time you spend with it, the richer it becomes, which, right, is the definition of art. If it's Roland Barthes, another this time French
Yeah,
theorist, talked about, literature is the question minus the answer. And
yeah,
and I think that's really what the theme of our conversation has been so far, is that Bowie is the question minus the
yeah,
answer, which is the stuff that's stimulating. That's the stuff that provides us with thought. The opposite of that is propaganda. The opposite of that is categorization. The opposite of that is finalization. And none of those feel like comfortable spaces to live in.
yeah.
So always a reminder about the question minus the answer.
Oh, you mentioned Roland Barth. I've written about him and Bowie and contemporary American politics, and there's so much more to talk about. So why don't we take a break? And if you're watching this, this is going to serve as a teaser to come back next week. But we're going to keep talking. But why don't we take a little break? But before we do, let me show everybody the book cover, which you may have noticed it behind me. But just so everybody knows the book that we're talking about, that here it is, Always Crashing in the Same Car. And I'm talking with its author, Lance Olsen, who's been kind enough to give me all this time. But I am just as enthralled with the conversation as I've been. So thank you for giving me this time. But why don't we take a little break now, and we will come back next week.